Well, welcome everyone. My name is Warren Binford. I'm a professor at the University of Colorado, and I was the chair of the first children's rights study group ever formed by the International Law Association. I'm joined today by three of the co-authors of the report that was created by that study group, Michael Garcia Bochenek, Ann Skelton, and Jessica Shidlow. We also have today Jaya Ramji Nagalis, who has read the study group and the study group report and has some feedback on it. That study group specifically focused on the enforcement of the rights of children in migration. And because the report is publicly available, we're not going to provide you with a formal presentation of what's said in that study group report, but instead are going to have a conversation first amongst ourselves about the challenges that children face with regard to violations of their rights and difficulties in enforcing those rights, and try and identify some solutions forward. And then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So just to give you a little bit of background on our panelists, Ann Skelton is a professor of law at the University of Pretoria, and she's also a member of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. Michael Garcia Bochenek is senior counsel to the Children's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch, and he focuses on juvenile justice and refugee and migrant children. Jessica Shidlow is staff attorney with Child USA and a national board certified counselor and member of the National Association of Counsel for Children. And Jaya Ramji Nagalis is the associate dean for academic affairs and the I. Herman Stern research professor at Temple University, where she currently specializes in refugee law and global migration law, among other studies. So in opening up our conversation today, I want to just get a thumbnail understanding of what rights children have when they are in the process of migrating. We know that there is an increase of children in migration in the 21st century that's being projected for a number of reasons, but it's not always clear to us what rights these children have. So, Ann, could you tell us a little bit about what rights children in migration have? You are muted, Ann.
Thanks very much, Warren. Obviously, children enjoy all the rights that they're entitled to under the Convention on the Rights of the Child when they're in situations of migration. And there are other supporting international law documents that would come to the fore. But some of the rights that children that are placed most at risk in the context of migration are obviously the right to, if they're traveling with families, the right to remain together with their families, to be protected from separation. Another one is the right to be protected from detention, a deprivation of liberty. And then when children have migrated and are now in new destination countries, they also have rights to their health care being upheld. They have rights to access education. So their socioeconomic rights will also kick in at some point once they're in their new countries. So there, full range of rights that might change a little depending on where they are in the trajectory of the migration process.
Thank you so much, Ann. Michael, I know that every time I talk to you, you're somewhere else in the world. And when I ask you what you're doing there, you seem to always be doing more research, interviewing more children and families, and writing more reports on children in migration around the world. What are some of the challenges and rights violations that you're seeing on the ground in the research that you've been doing for Human Rights Watch this last decade?
Well, really, they fall into maybe 3 or 4 broad categories. One of them relates to detention, which is unfortunately too common in several major receiving countries. The United States is the biggest of those, probably, but also in Mexico and in parts of Europe, Australia, and elsewhere, we've seen an extensive use of detention in ways that are both, well, certainly contrary to the international standards, violations of children's rights, and profoundly damaging. We know from the research that any length of time in detention is really damaging for children. And what we're seeing too often are really prolonged periods of time in various forms of detention. So that's one issue. Another very big one is, particularly for children traveling on their own, the threshold question of whether they're children at all. And so subjecting children to really arbitrary age assessment processes, often in a way that suggests to children not only that they are lying, but denying their very identity. And really extended procedures to try to have that question resolved, with the result that the children are losing time and really in despair at the uncertainty of everything. And I guess the final one is just reception conditions in general. And so what is too often the case is that children arrive either alone or with their families, and they reach a place where they think they have finally found safety, but instead are effectively confined to camps, placed in other kinds of facilities that may or may not be closed facilities, but often do not have the basic services, the basic needs, do not provide for the basic needs that they have. Not just things like adequate food, shelter, and clothing, for example, but also adequate health services and access to education. And all of these things we just keep finding these kinds of problems over and over again in a variety of settings. And what's really striking is that it doesn't really seem to matter how many resources the receiving state has, or if it does. To the contrary, what we frequently see is that the least well-off countries who receive the most numbers of refugees are the most generous in their policies, whereas those who are most well-off and most able to provide far more than the bare minimum are not even doing that bare minimum.
Jessica, I know that you've taken a deep dive around the age assessment policies and practices that Michael referred to. Can you tell us a little bit about what your research has shown? What do these practices look like? Are they reliable? Not? If not, why not? Could you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in your research?
Sure. So as Michael said, individuals are having difficulty establishing their status as children at all. And therefore they're not getting, the services and protection that they're entitled to. And an important thing to note is that there really is no single method for accurately determining chronological age. And certainly none of the methods that are currently being used are reliable. All of the methods that are used, and there are medical and non-medical methods, all of which have a significant margin of error, all of which, or at least the use of radiographic imaging, which is pretty common across all nations, that those reference materials that are utilized were developed in like the 1930s and 40s, and they were examining upper middle class children of Northern European descent. So their applicability to the population that we see in the context of child migration is really questionable. And I think overall what we're seeing is that nations are increasingly using age assessment procedures as a form of migration control. And as Michael stated, there's everybody's supposed to operate from this principle of, presumption of minority. So where there are doubts as to whether the individual presenting at reception is an adult or a child, you should always assume that they're a child, provide the services until, it can be proven otherwise, or if it is proven otherwise. And what we're seeing is just a general skepticism of individuals, but specifically of even identifying documents there's this presumption that they're fraudulent. And I think a lot of it probably just has to do, honestly, with the anti-immigrant rhetoric, which has, painted immigrants as untrustworthy. And I think that frame of mind really guides a lot of these processes.
Thank you, Jessica. And I know that right now you're sitting on the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, and I'm wondering, are there other rights violations that Michael and Jessica haven't talked about that you're seeing at the committee level? And tell us a little bit about those. Or are you seeing different communications filed that only touch on this body of rights violations that Jessica and Michael have described? You're muted again, Ann.
There are various ways in which the committee engages with issues relating to migration. One is through the state party reporting processes, where we would come across a very wide range of issues, including things like what states are doing to protect children against statelessness, which is something that hasn't been mentioned so far, but would also be, so in other words, documentation. What can we expect from consular services in relation to children and so on? So we talk about that a lot in state party dialogues, in addition to the issues that we've been talking here. But we also have a communications procedure, and in our individual communications, we've had a number of cases dealing with age assessment, which is what Jessica's been talking about. But we've also had a few cases that deal with issues relating to non-refoulement and the rules, regarding what happens when children perhaps entered through one state but then moved to another state, and how children's cases or cases involving children should be evaluated when it comes to decisions as to whether to put them back to the first country through which they entered. There, I think that there are a different set of considerations when you're looking at children who may well have settled now in the country that they're living in, may have learned a new language, engaged in education for a number of years. Some of them may have special health considerations that would make it risky for them to be placed either back in their countries of origin or in states from which they come. Other interesting issues that the committee's dealt with is risks that children may face if they are repatriated. And one of these that the committee's dealt with twice is the risk of female genital mutilation, for example. And then more recently, we've been dealing with cases from Spain that have to do with the right to education for children who are non-citizens, actually, and also not having permanent residence status, but who are living in Spain as the country where the case pertained to, although they're actually from Morocco. And there the committee found a violation of the right and found that Spain must provide education to children regardless of their parents' migration status.
Thank you, Ann. Jaya, in the work that you do, you're coming at this more as a human rights expert, and particularly within the area of refugee rights. And I'm wondering if you're seeing in the work that you're doing more broadly in other human rights arenas, if you're seeing other issues come up with regard to children and families in migration. What are you seeing in the work that you're doing?
Yeah. Thanks so much. And thanks for including me. I just want to start by saying that the report is really tremendous and such an incredible contribution, lays out the legal framework so clearly and so helpfully. And so, I think my role on this panel is really to think about what are the next steps, right? What else can be done. So I just wanted to zoom out a little bit. And I think what I say will kind of touch on things that both Michael and Ann, points that both Michael and Ann made. So Ann made a point about, right, the whole process. So I think one way to think about children's rights in migration is we have all these different steps of the process. And often we kind of think of the border and we think of adjudication and access to adjudication. But before that, there's transit, which is a huge part of the process. And there are enormous risks to children during transit that we see. Perhaps they're the most vulnerable there. They're vulnerable all the way along. But they're extremely vulnerable there. And also relating to a point Michael made, I agree that, you know, often the countries who are doing the most are the ones who are least resourced. But one challenge that we see increasingly is that we see that destination states are engaging in extraterritorial border control, so pushing their borders out, right? And I'll take the example I'm most familiar with, which is the US pushing its border out into Mexico. And so then what we see is states that were historically not destination states becoming destination states. So we see states like Mexico that used to be a transit state that just doesn't have the infrastructure to process asylum seekers, and now are being forced to process these claims because the US doesn't even want these kids, these families anywhere near its border. So that is another challenge that's really increasing the risks to children. And then, of course, in the current context, we see, particularly in the US with Title 42, we just see pandemic border closures, and we've seen that, you know, throughout destination states, which makes kids even more vulnerable. I'm sure everyone in the audience has seen, right, pictures of kids in camps by the border where their parents are saying, we can't even get water to wash our hands, right? How are we supposed to keep our kids safe from this pandemic? So the border is a real problem. And then reception, of course, which you guys discussed, and just not a lot of thought put towards what children need to thrive, right? Putting kids in this carceral system, and actually we should be thinking about what do kids need to thrive, and thinking about it from the best interests of the children. Of course, there are many extra challenges in terms of access to the asylum process, to any kind of legal process, which you guys just discussed in the report. And then, of course, again, you know, what we're seeing a lot of currently in the US is expulsion. And, you know, the Trump administration did stop expelling children in November of last year after a court order made them stop expelling children. But we're seeing expulsions of kids. And again, there they are just incredibly vulnerable. So thinking through all of these stages of migration, there are just so many risks to them. And, you know, we see, as was mentioned earlier, right, we see the pandemic layered on top of these xenophobic populist politics that's just creating real challenges for anyone in migration, but then, of course, particular challenges for children.
Jaya, I'm gonna try and engage you, and you know that I can be very pointed. And somewhat provocative. And so I just ask for your grace as we try and drill down a little bit on something that you raised that I think a lot of us are witnessing, and that Jessica has touched on. And it relates to age assessment that Michael and his colleagues at Human Rights Watch and the research about that migration process, particularly from the Northern Triangle to the US-Mexican border, you know, have reports of children who tell Mexican officials that they are adults when they're crossing into Mexico because they don't want to be put into the juvenile homes that the Mexican government has set up, that the US government has encouraged the Mexican government to set up to prevent them from coming to the US, despite the fact that most of them have family or other loved ones here. And that then when the children get to the US border, the Mexican officials have shared with US officials the age reported at the Mexican border, and that this is happening at other national borders as well. And so you have information sharing that really is that extraterritoriality that you cited. And so then the US government is in a position where it can rebut that presumption of minority that Jessica is saying should be the standard. And they have evidence because of what the child self-reported. And yet the child, of course, had that incentive to misreport, you know, at the Mexican border. And so how do you resolve those types of practices? Is it wrong for the US government to be sharing information with other foreign governments with regard to, for example, minority status around people in migration? Or, is that a good practice where we're able to track different people in migration and have some sense of who people are, who they claim to be, what age they claim to be, et cetera?
Yeah, I have two thoughts on that, one more pragmatic and one less pragmatic. So let's start out with the more pragmatic, which is simply that the US government and frankly anyone relying on data should be just careful about the data they rely on, right? Garbage in, garbage out, right? So they need to understand the challenges, and certainly from an enforcement perspective, I can see the rationale for information sharing. It's an enormous, we could spend this whole panel talking about the real problems with information sharing and the challenges of AI. It's right. We haven't even talked about the challenges of AI, of technology at the border. So I have grave concerns about it as someone coming from a human rights perspective. I can certainly see why a government would want to do that, but the government also has to be incredibly careful with the data that's coming in. And as someone, I'm very familiar with the data in the US asylum process, and there are problems with that data. And so we think that the data that we're getting from border control officials talking to kids in Mexico, right? How reliable are they? So I think that's one thing I'll say. Then kind of taking off my pragmatic lawyer hat and putting on my totally unpragmatic law professor hat. Why are these kids transiting through Mexico? Could they get on an airplane and come to the US, right? This is all a story of increasing visa requirements, carrier sanctions, right? When I came into the field didn't look anything like this. So could we think about a situation I think the ideal situation, and this is an idea that my co-author Andy Schoenholtz likes, so I always give him credit for this, an asylum visa, right? Where we could start with kids could get on they're paying 10 times more at least to be smuggled, and it's so much more dangerous for them, right? Is there a way we could think about doing that? And then short of that, of course, we have these processes, most famously or infamously the Central American Minors Program, where minors can be processed in the region. That one was not successful. I think the Biden administration is interested in starting maybe a similar process. I could see how that might work. It's pretty logistically difficult to happen on the ground, but again, then you're not putting kids at that kind of risk, and they can actually, they're not put in a position where they are told by someone, maybe by the coyotes they're working with, maybe by someone else, that they have to lie about their age, right? And then you have a process that is much safer and much fairer. So that's, to me, that's the end goal. I understand we're not going to get there tomorrow, but I think we all have to ask the fundamental question of why are these kids transiting in these incredibly dangerous ways in the age of air travel. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and I want to follow up with just one question, and then I'll move to another panelist. But why do you think that the Central American Minors Program failed? You said obviously that's a failed program, and yet the Trump administration ended that program after pretty early on in its process. And an argument could be made that it actually was a successful program, but that a successful program was ended, and it's a program that could have kept thousands of children from having to make that journey. So why are you framing that as an unsuccessful program?
So I think the problem was, and I think it's certainly worth trying again. I think a couple of the problems were it was very hard for the kids to access safely, right? So it's hard for kids kids particularly who are being targeted by gangs and other violent criminal organizations to get to the locations they needed to get to, and the documentation process was pretty cumbersome. But I think if someone thought it through more carefully and could come up with a streamlined process or just a process that works better for the kids. I mean, I at last I checked, the numbers were, kind of fewer than 100 kids who went through this program. And right, there are lots of kids who should have been able to come through this program. So they need to think about, right, they need to think of it as with everything from the perspective of a kid on the ground, and what is it possible for them? How is it possible for them to get access to the location they need to access? And then how to also make it from the perspective of the parent who's here, right? How do we make it possible for them to be able to access the process? So, we'll see if the Biden administration can get there.
Great. Thank you,
I mean, it
Jaya.
certainly happens with refugee resettlement all the time. So why shouldn't we be able to do it in Central America?
Especially with children. So in building off of that, Michael, I know that Anne brought up the violation of the rights of children to education, and also brought up that the migratory process, and you actually are trying to do some research about the education of children, not once they arrive in their destination state, but during that migratory process. And you're looking particularly at the disruptions in education of children who are having to travel through Mexico as a transit country, which usually takes by foot, somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks, but oftentimes because of the pressure on the Mexican government to place these children either in different settlements, or if they're with family, or different communities if they're with family, or in juvenile homes if they're not, that it's sometimes literally taking months or even years. And of course, all this could be solved with Jaya's suggestion that we have develop a policy that allows child refugees to get on airplanes and to be transported safely for a matter of hours rather than days or weeks or months or years by and to loved ones. But could you tell us a little bit about your interest and your thoughts around those disruptions in education during the migratory process, and what it is that you think we can learn from that research?
Sure. Well, I think that there are a lot of contexts in which education gets disrupted. You can imagine people who have to move from one place to another because of natural disaster or because of other similar concerns like that, even if they're not intending to leave their home country. Or in another context, children who are detained because they're in conflict with the law also will face some disruptions. There is a bit of a misunderstanding about those kinds of contexts in that I'm often seeing even state officials telling me, well, there's no possibility of providing education to children who are in transit, whether that's in transit through a detention center or in transit through a country or whatever the situation is. And we know that's not true. There are models developed by education specialists of how to do this, and in particular of how to do this in a context where you don't have children arriving neatly at the beginning of the school year, and then departing at the end of the semester or whatever the natural break is. So some countries have done better jobs than others at this. At one point, Brazil had very good models for dealing with children at least on paper, for dealing with children in detention settings, so that it was able to explain what a pedagogic process would look like in those contexts, and frankly was doing better on that ground than on many other grounds in the detention context when I was there. But so I think that the first thing is that there are models for how to do this. The second thing is that, in particular, in a context like Mexico, the delays may end up being far longer than the couple of weeks or couple of months that we see in other settings where education can effectively be delivered. And so there really becomes even less justification for not providing it. It then becomes a question of identifying children, of putting them in touch with the school resources, and overcoming whatever reservations the children might have, as well as dealing with some of the practicalities. How do they get to school safely is a big one. How do they afford, if books or papers or uniforms are the issue, how do they afford those? Or can there be a way of excusing those requirements or providing for them in an alternative way? A big issue that we've identified in Mexico is reservation of the parents. Both it's a safety issue or a perceived safety issue, particularly in border towns bordering the US, that can be very, very dangerous, particularly for migrants. And in particular, given their experience of school in home countries, here I'm thinking of in Honduras or El Salvador, for example, where schools are often sites of gang violence and gang recruitment. and sexual assault primarily for girls, but not exclusively. All of these things have to be thought through, and it's, I think, this resistance from parents that is a serious one. It can't just be, oh, the parents don't want to send the kids, and so that's the end of the story. There are ways of engaging parents in conversations and identifying the very real concerns they've got, and then addressing them. And one final component, which is a factor in Mexico in the last 3 or 4 years in particular, but not only during that period of time, is that it's not just the length of the journey itself to reach the US-Mexico border, the northern border, but also those impediments that we just heard about once they get to the northern border. And meaning that at times they have no idea how long it will take to cross or to recross. Here I'm referring to, of course, currently the possibility of summary expulsion, purportedly for public health reasons. Before that, it was the Remain in Mexico program. So people who had already entered the United States, who were then sent back to Mexico to wait until who knew when to get their asylum case heard. Many of those people had to, before they could even enter the US, when they were trying to cross at a regular point of entry to put in an application for asylum, had been told to wait under a system called metering, which was essentially take a number and then keep checking back every day or week until your number comes up. All of these things, all of these programs and others resulted in significant delays at the border and meant that it was very difficult to plan anything at all. And I think are also, clearly serious factors in decisions whether or not to enroll children in schools.
So with all of this going on, Jessica, I know that you've done a lot of research around the toll that these rights violations take on children, psychologically and sociologically. Can you tell us a little bit about what the most current research shows about the effects on children?
Sure. So, obviously children in migration are, commonly denied access to essentially their basic needs. And that includes, like Michael said, education, healthcare, in the case of when children are arriving with families, family separation, and each of these individually is a separate form of trauma or maltreatment that they experience. And broadly speaking, what we know is that there's a strong correlation between these adverse childhood events, or ACEs, and negative effects across the lifespan in terms of neurodevelopment, emotional, cognitive development, as well as an increased risk for psychological and physical ailments and disability. So any immigration procedure or practice that increases the likelihood that a child will experience some form of trauma exposure is just tremendously costly, both for that child, but also for society as well. The research shows that the average cost to the individual is about $831,000 over the course of their lifetime. And for society as a whole, it's upwards of $2 trillion, and that's annually. And so there's really something in it for everyone to invest in making sure that children's needs are sufficiently met. And then, to the point I think Michael made, detention in particular really contributes or exacerbates, a number of pre-existing vulnerabilities that this population might have. And so for example, we know that children who are detained have a 12 0.3% greater likelihood of experiencing PTSD. And that PTSD presents with complex symptoms. And the interesting thing is that, you know, when they're free of these environmental stressors of detention, we see these children thrive. They're resilient, they're able to do well in school. So what that tells us is that, you know, this is unique to the detention experience, and that, you know, the pre and post immigration process didn't produce the same levels of trauma that the detention itself caused.
So when that happens, $830,000, we haven't even really talked that much about the children who are separated from their parents under the zero tolerance policy. The Wall Street Journal just reported that the Biden administration, you know, the Department of Justice is thinking about settling the hundreds of lawsuits that have been brought against the US government because of the Trump's zero tolerance policy. They're thinking about settling it for $450,000 per person. You know, some families would receive $1 million. And I wonder, is that the best way to resolve this? Is suing the governments who violate the children's rights the best way to resolve this? Are there political considerations that should caution against that? Are there better forums? I mean, and shouldn't these kids just come to you and your colleagues on the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and say, hey, the trauma that I've been subjected to by this government is likely to cost me, for the children, I think you said that was for the children who had been detained, Jessica, is $830,000. So every time that a government who is a receiving state detains a child, should they just come to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and ask you to hold that government accountable? What's the best forum to make right these types of traumatic experiences that the children are being subject to intentionally by some of the receiving governments and transit governments as well?
Well, of course, if we're talking about children whose rights have been violated in the United States, the big stumbling block would be the fact that the United States is the only country that hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so that would leave the children with no remedy to come to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. But all other children in all other countries would be able to do so. You know, the cases that have been brought under our individual communications procedures so far, the kind of remedies that the committee has been setting have actually been a combination of compensation, but relatively small compensation, I would say, small amounts of compensation for individuals. Far more focus is placed on systemic remedy in order to try to fix the problems that are happening in the whole migration processing system. And so the cases, particularly those where we can see a pattern of problems that are occurring, we're giving orders or directives that are telling the states how to fix those problems in the system. And also even going down to things like training officials, ensuring that they understand international law if they're going to be dealing with children in these contexts. So I think that is the kind of approach that our committee has taken. That's not to say that, obviously all individuals must have access to justice. And if there are systems to hold states accountable for failure, I wouldn't say that should not be done. But I think at an international level, we are generally trying to guide states to change their practices and processes to come in line with the international norms and expectations.
Thank you, Anne. Jaya, are there fora that are available to the children here who are coming to the U.S. to enforce their rights when their rights are being violated? Are there international fora that are available, separate from or after they've exhausted remedies at the domestic level? Since we're not a party to the rights of the child, even though to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, even though we we contributed more language and made more revisions to the contributions that other countries made than any other country in the world. And even though we have signed, which indicates an intent to ratify, and certainly an obligation not to abrogate, but, are there other forums that are available to the kids coming to the US whose rights are violated?
Yeah, so I would say, unfortunately, that's a common refrain with the US when it comes to human rights documents. So we're not signed on to the optional protocol that would allow us to receive individual complaints against the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And, I similarly with the Inter-American system, right, there are ways that judgments can be made against the US, but we haven't properly accepted the individual complaint mechanism. So I think, and again, putting on my academic hat here, what I would love to see is, so there is still the state-to-state option. If another state had the courage to take to bring a complaint before the US under the ICCPR, even the International Court of Justice. So we saw the Diallo case, the Guinea versus DRC. We've seen individual cases between countries around migration questions, and the International Court of Justice has been willing to resolve those. I think the real challenge there is, of course, the US provides a lot of aid and a lot of support, so countries are not that willing to bring it to task in an international forum. But that is the main possibility, though. I think there are certainly ways. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has certainly issued some good decisions because we are party to at least the American Charter. We can also think about using human rights in different ways, though, of course, and reference, using it for training. We can use human rights just for naming and shaming and saying, this is a human rights violation, even, and, that's kind of what we often have to resort to when it comes to the US. I think also thinking about the ways we can work transnationally, because this is a transnational question. So working transnationally with social movements, with families, and just trying to raise awareness about what the US is doing. That's I think certainly another helpful path forward. And just the last thing that I'll say, and maybe a slightly more optimistic note, is I do think, and I think this kind of links to some of what Anne was saying. I think the Trump administration, as Michael discussed a little bit, they throughout the time they were in power, they just worked to decimate the US asylum system. But the part of that got people's attention when we talk about the general public was the separation of families at the border. We think about Aylan Kurdi, we think about Valeria Martinez Ramirez, We think about, when we see these extreme harms happening to children, that's when the public starts to pay attention. And I want to be very clear, we do not want to see any of these harms to children, but it also, sparks an awareness in the general public that what is happening is a gross violation, of human rights. And we often see, children being given rights in kind of pilot programs that might then be extended to the rest of the population. So thinking about the Central American Minors Program we were talking about before, thinking about representation in the US in immigration proceedings, So we can think about ways that children can maybe help to lift everyone else up. That's perhaps a vain hope, but trying to sound a note of optimism here.
And I'm going to thank you, Jaya. I'm going to open up this question to all of you. And it really is moving away from the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and the US situation, and looking more broadly at children around the world who are in the migration process and their rights are violated. Are there other methods to enforce their rights other than some of the domestic lawsuits that we're seeing in the United States right now and elsewhere around the world, and and the individual complaint mechanism, and of course reporting mechanism with the UN committee? Are there other ways to enforce children's rights around the world, other fora?
I have an initial reaction. I'm sure others have thoughts too, which is that a lot of the solutions that we really need, thinking about Anne's comment about making systemic changes, courts and quasi-judicial bodies may not always be the best venue for this kind of change. And so, if we take family separation as one example, cash, nobody will turn that down, right? But that could well come in a way that doesn't really reach everybody who needs it. That depends on who filed litigation, who's known, who. It could end up being quite arbitrary, and it may well still not cover the demonstrated need that the families have. And so if the goal is to put people in the position they should have been, but for family separation, that means also restoring, that means taking care of the evident mental health consequences, the real trauma that people have faced, trying to find some way of providing services that people need, that the children and families need to recover from that trauma. It means thinking about, if they're not in the United States now because they were returned at some point, maybe at different points, of bringing them back and allowing them to start their claims all over again. It means giving them the legal support that everybody should be getting from the start to deal with what's really a very, very complicated system. And it means what we in international circles speak of as guarantees of non-repetition, something that really gives us confidence in policy terms and in legal terms, right? Like that set in law, there are guarantees to make sure that this never happens again. I think it also means truth telling. I think it means really accounting for the abuses in a way that has been done to a very limited extent in one or two really good internal investigations. Certainly the work of the ACLU, the work of other groups has brought to light a lot of what happened, but there needs to be a more public state-sponsored accounting for these abuses, just as there was in other situations of grievous human rights violations. That's just one example, but I think what that suggests is that the solution is political, and that we're deploying all of the different advocacy opportunities we have to achieve that political decision, or at least as much of that solution as possible, bearing in mind that migration is always going to be a controversial, contentious topic.
So that sounds really vague and complicated and difficult to do. So isn't it really just easier for us to create another treaty? Let's draft another treaty. Let's get all the countries to agree to what the specific rights are for children in migration and give them a forum in which they can enforce their rights. Why aren't we doing that? Why isn't anybody pushing for a treaty for children in migration?
I mean, I think I'll agree with Michael on that one. I think the rights exist on paper, and it's about the political obstacles and right, that's what we need to think about overcoming. And we can use human rights language to some extent to do that. We can think about the way social movements might work. Another angle that another framing that I have been thinking about a lot lately and find very helpful is the thinking about it through a solidarity frame. So my friend Obi Okafor is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to solidarity. So thinking about obligations that we owe other humans rather than individual rights, right, may be another right if we can start thinking about these children as humans to whom we owe obligations, rather than individuals who have to invoke their rights through litigation, right? That may be a way to start changing the way we think about that. Obviously, you're right, that's complex, that's long-term. But I do think we need to be thinking on all levels. We need to be thinking about, okay, litigation today for these families, but how do we move ourselves closer to a place, right, where these rights are actually, that exist on paper, are actually going to be enforced.
So part of what I hear you saying with regard to relational, definitions or relational identities and obligations is really that Ubuntu approach that we hear from South African peoples, and you of course could describe this better than I could, which is I define myself through you. Who I am is defined by the way I interact with you and how I treat you, so that we are not just these independent vessels, but that we understand what our relations are with each person with whom we interact. And you think that maybe we should be changing our human rights framework so that it's not so individualized, but instead it's maybe more relational, Jaya? Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly. And I think we see that across a lot of different cultures, and so thinking about what is the obligation I owe to others as humans, and so right, we could think about it also as nations, right? What are the obligations we owe to other humans, rather than individual rights to be invoked? And right, individual rights should still exist, but also right, thinking about this as who are we as a nation? Who do we want to be, and what are our obligations to the rest of humanity? And I think especially coming from the level of privilege, and the kind of the history, the complex histories, I think, right, especially thinking currently about Haiti, and Central America as well, right? I think we really need a shift in the way that we're thinking about these questions.
And I know that, Anne, in the work that you're doing at the UNCRC, you in fact are trying to remind states about their relational obligations to the children within their borders, even if they're not citizens of that particular country. What are some of the most significant decisions that the UNCRC has issued recently around children in migration? And I'm talking particularly, through the communications procedure rather than the reporting procedure.
Yes. I think one of the things that the committee tries to remind states parties is that children are children first, and migrants second. So it's that constant trying to remind states that they have to actually look at the best interests of the child in every phase of every decision that is made about children. One can see that this is something that is that's states really grapple with, because they're always looking at this from a migration policy perspective rather than a children's rights perspective. So it's a kind of different imperative. And so I would say some of the most significant decisions that we've made relate to the fact that children must be given the benefit of the doubt, that in fact we should think about a presumption of childhood, as Jessica had spoken about. This is something that the committee has also said, advising states not to put so much energy into fighting against this definition of children as children, and facilitating situations for them to allow them to be able to get the information that they need to show that they are in fact children, whereas at the moment many states are just blocking children at the front stage of that. And I think the committee's decisions relating to the right to education are quite far-reaching, although really all they do is state what is already there in international law, but still in quite a definite way. And in a way that also reminded the state that, procedurally, it's really important to ensure that children and their parents know what their rights are, know where to go to enforce those rights, have the right to legal representation to support them in trying to get access to the rights that they have, and always also having the possibility of review of decisions as well, or appeals. So I think all of these issues, what's really important is the remedial part of it, explaining, how we want to see things change on the ground so that children can actually access the rights that they have under international law.
So, Anne, I'm going to ask you to help me resolve a years-long dispute that I've been having with Michael. I'm always saying that we should be relying on the first and second optional protocol, which the U.S. has ratified, with regard to child soldiers and child trafficking, and that for those children who have experiences that fall within the corners of those two protocols, that we could come to the CRC and ask you to help and utilize those procedures, understanding that the U.S. hasn't ratified the communications protocol, of course. Can we do that? And Jai, you might have an opinion on this as well. I'd particularly like to hear if you agree with me that we might be able to get in through one of these optional protocols, or is Michael right? Is that just too attenuated that we shouldn't spend too much time or energy for me to continue to try and plug this into our various strategies together?
Well, you are right that the United States does come to report to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. In fact, my very first session of the Committee, America, came to report on those two optional protocols. And I do remember that the committee kept on putting a lot of pointed questions of what could be brought in, and the officials present were saying, I think you're bringing in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We haven't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So I think there'd be a lot of that, but I think it would be worth the game. So, in the reporting procedure, NGOs, civil society can bring alternative reports and raise issues of this nature, and can also come and meet with the committee about that prior to the reporting process. So I guess actually it must be coming up again for a review fairly soon. And so this would be a good opportunity. And of course, it's a different regime now. So maybe there would be a more positive response this time. I don't think there's anything to be lost.
Well, and the thing is that it does provide for remedies. They do provide for remedies, and particularly integration into community, which a lot of this ties into, as well as full psychological and social recovery. And so I continue to think that this is the only area in which I'm right and Michael's wrong. He's usually right about everything, but this one I think that we've underutilized. I want to leave time for Q&A, and so I'm going to ask that the participants in our audience that they put their questions into the Q&A. I've got a couple of questions pending now. While we're doing that, Michael, I want to try and end on another positive note besides giving us hope for some new strategies, and ask you, given the number of countries that you go to and the number of children and families that you interview on the front lines, is anyone doing anything right? Is there any hope, knowing that we're looking at continued armed conflict, we're looking at continued economic inequalities, we're looking at an increase in climate crises due to the climate change? Is there any hope in the work that you're doing on the front lines and what you're seeing? Any best practices?
Yes, I mean, what I think is the issue is that it's not a travel in a consistent direction, and so there's a lot of sort of improvement and then backpedaling, and things can improve on one issue while remaining not particularly good on a lot of other issues. But I'm just thinking of a few of these sort of glimmers of hope. Greece in the last year and a half or so started to put in place some, albeit limited, very significant improvements in the reception centers for children that it finally has agreed to move off of the islands. That doesn't mean that it's enough, and it doesn't mean that there aren't still lots of kids who are in really bad situations, both on the island and on the mainland. And it doesn't mean that Greece is doing what it has known that it needs to do, has known for the last decade and a half that it needs to do for new arrivals. But it is hopeful. That is really, really helpful. I think we're seeing some pretty significant, well, already some positive legal principles in Spanish law that Spain may be increasingly complying with, in no small part because of decisions by the Committee on the Rights of the Child. I think that in France, where on paper the legislation is really positive for children, where minority is intended to be declaratory, meaning that there shouldn't be any documents presented, that there should be no question about age assessment, at least at the initial stage of arrival. Whenever we put forward findings that border police or that other officials are not complying with their requirements, there are improvements nearly immediately, at least at that border post, and maybe for only a little bit of time, but at least somebody is paying attention. So I think that there are these kinds of, and then of course we have in the US, just yesterday, the DHS secretary announced the ending of the Remain in Mexico program. So, you know, nobody's been placed in that program since for quite a number of months, but many of us may know in this session that through a variety of pressures, including litigation, it did appear at one point, until very recently, that the government would have to reopen this program and start sending people to Mexico once again in some way. But I think as a result of what's a really well-researched, pretty thorough legal memo, that's become much less likely. So yeah, we've had lots of reasons, I think, for hope.
And I did see this morning that your report on MPP was cited by the Department of Homeland Security in reaching that decision. So congratulations, and thank you so much for the research that you did to help support that decision. Before we move
Warren, can I just add in something else that I've seen from the committee sometimes when large numbers of children get displaced through war, and then you've got huge numbers of children who need healthcare services and education and so on. We have seen good work by UNICEF, for example, in supporting double schooling. So in other words, the children are attending school during daytime, and then in the afternoon there'll be another session for children, because there isn't enough space in schools, and so they're actually having to do schedules of schooling to reach all the children. So one does see some good examples of from that point of view as well. And again, these tend to also be countries that are themselves very poor, where that kind of work is being done.
Thank you so much, Anne, for adding that. I'm going to go ahead and put the CLA information on the screen now so that everyone can go ahead and write down this number in case you'd like to claim CLE. There is CLE available, credit available at least in New York and California, and other states may be able to apply for it as well. And so please cite number 248222 to get this information, and you can go ahead and apply or request the certificate, download the certificate, I should say, at www.apiarbitrationplace.com/ILA. So go ahead and write down that information. And then let's talk now about the questions that we're receiving from the audience. So we have a question that reads, what are possible ways that an individual state can ensure that children are well protected from physical harm and war during migration? So what can we do in those situations? Anyone? And if you want to read the question, it's down in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. what are possible ways an individual state can ensure that children are well protected from physical harm and war during migration?
I have an initial answer for this, and others probably have other thoughts. I mean, I think this can end up being quite operational in nature. That is, there's quite a lot that states already should be doing to protect children from all forms of violence, to make sure they're not subject to neglect, and whether or not these are children in migration or not. And I think the answer might depend on whether we're talking about children who are transiting through countries, in which case, it's likely that the state of transit has some advance warning that migration is happening, and should be putting in place systems to identify, to find solutions, to attend to the needs of children, and so on. And in many ways, they're just drawing on what should be existing structures to do that. Existing child protection authorities, existing even law enforcement authorities with the requisite training and sensitivity to be able to deal with this kind of with these kinds of scenarios, with these populations. These resources should in fact exist already, so it may be a question of redirecting and repurposing. And I think the answer is much more complicated if we're talking about a country that is in fact at war, in which case, services of all kinds may well be disrupted.
Thank you, Michael. Anyone else?
Maybe a generic kind of answer is that one needs to ensure that best interest determinations is happening across all of the decisions that are occurring. So that's one way of making sure that whatever's happening, a child safeguarding kind of approach is being followed.
Thank you, Anne. Jaya,
You muted yourself, Warren.
Sorry, there is a question, Jaya, that's directed specifically towards you based on your response in the Q&A. It says that based on your response to the question pertaining to a possible Biden settlement, if a state were to be willing to jeopardize possible U.S. support and bring a case against the U.S., would it be based off a similar theory that the ICC used in the Miramar case, while individual, that because of where the refugees and migrants ended up in a ratifying state, the court had jurisdiction? Or is this based off of a different idea due to this issue being a state versus state issue?
So I was actually just thinking about the jurisdiction under the ICCPR for states to issue right to bring complaints against other state parties, and then also that complaint could also be brought before the International Court of Justice, because there's an article in the ICCPR itself that allows that. You have to sign up to the optional protocol to accept individual complaints, but you can file a state can file a complaint against another state. But and others may know better than me. I don't think any that has ever happened. Certainly not with the U.S. as recipients.
Thank you, Jaya. And I know that we had touched on earlier the closure of the border due to COVID-19. And in the chat, Michael had asked whether COVID gives the state the possibility to close the border and whether that could forbid migrants from entering its territory. And is this enough of a ground to justify closure of the borders? And Michael doesn't limit it to refugees, but if there are different responses for different populations, we would love to hear them. So anyone?
Yeah, I'm actually happy to jump in on. Oh, do you want to go ahead, Anne? Because I was just speaking. I'm happy to jump in on the refugee front. I think under the Refugee Convention, it's certainly not a justification for closing the borders. I mean, possibly in March of 2020, and we didn't know what this disease was, but certainly not now. So, right, the Refugee Convention tells us, right, that we can't rule a refugee unless there are reasonable grounds for regarding them as a danger to the security of the country. And so the question is, can a public health situation rise to that level? And I think whatever you think about what happened when the pandemic was initially in place, there's certainly no justification now, right? We have vaccines, we understand, right, that the public health actions that have to happen, masking, washing your hands, right, all of these kinds of things. So I think there's really no argument, and I can actually share in the chat if people are interested. I just wrote something recently about this on just security regarding the expulsion of the current expulsion of the Haitians. So I can share that, but I'm more interested in hearing what Anne has to say.
Well, I just wanted to point out that when COVID restrictions first started to kick in, the United Nations treaty bodies all issued kind of special statements in relation to the limitations of rights in states of emergency, and the fact that under the ICCPR, there is a requirement for proper notification of states of emergency and derogation of rights, and that whole debate about non-derogability of rights. Suddenly everybody started reading up because it had been a while since we'd realized how important that was. But I think that what's really important is the fact that it has to obviously be reasonable, proportionate. Any of the limitations, many rights can be limited in a public health emergency, but it has to be reasonable, it has to be proportionate and time bound. And as time has gone on, this would have become more and more unreasonable. So in the very early stages, when we didn't know exactly how transmissible it was and who was going to be the most affected and so on, it could be reasonable for states to place limits on migration and movement as they did. But it's, that soon began to change the more we knew about the virus. And I think a lot of states just got stuck with their original take and didn't shift their policies very quickly. It's taken a really long time to lift many of the restrictions on movement, even for legal migrants, I might say.
Wonderful. I want to close out our program today by thanking our panelists. We are so grateful for the expertise that you bring to this area of work, not just today, but every day, and the difference that all of you are making in the world as we struggle with increased migration of children and families in the 21st century. I want to thank our audience for joining us today and being interested in learning more about this issue and continuing to explore ways to try and advocate for children and their rights, particularly in the migration process. Do look in the next year or so for opportunities to serve on what we hope will be another Children's Rights Committee. It actually will be the first committee, so no longer a study group, but hopefully a committee if a proposal is approved by the Executive Committee of the International Law Association. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you out in the field. Bye now.